I thought we'd batted this story away, but no, the Bank of America wants something to do with it. You see, a year ago there was a real simple worry with Grand Theft Auto 6, and it was this: what if GTA 6 is the game that finally makes a $100 game normal? And I don't mean for a collector's edition, not for some bundle with a bunch of extra nonsense you don't need, but for the base game. But now, the pressure's coming from a bit of a different place. One Bank of America analyst is making a more specific argument, and it's this: GTA 6 should cost $80. Not just because Rockstar can probably get away with it, but because if GTA 6 doesn't raise its prices, then the rest of the industry can't. Because you may not want to pay higher prices, but Bank of America thinks it could save the games industry. So no, it's not about price gouging people, it's charging more for the greater good. Let's get into the story. I'll open with a quote: "We think it's in Take-Two's self-interest as a publisher and partner to many developers to raise the price point for the entire industry." Now that quote is coming out of basically the replacement to E3. It's this event called Icon. It's hosted by our good friends at the Entertainment Software Association. It's in LA, and it's very much less about game trailers and things, and a hell of a lot more about C-suite executives, senior business leaders, all getting together for a lovely chit-chat. Now, our story kicked into gear when Bank of America analyst Omar Dasuki told Seeking Alpha, who are basically a financial site, that he believes Take-Two will set an $80 price tag for GTA 6, and more than that, he thinks it's essential that they do it. Of course, that quote that I just covered is coming from someone who profits from the games industry, or at least the firm he represents does. It doesn't come from someone who works in the games industry, and that wording really matters, because he's not talking about raising the price of GTA 6 only, he is talking about raising the price point for the entire industry. Effectively, raising the ceiling and probably, raising the floor a wee bit too. This is not a surprising stance for someone whose job is basically investing in the games industry. What they want is a future that might be expensive to you, but of course would be lucrative to them. And with that, we now get to go to the shareholder pressure that's driving all this. We all know shareholder pressure drives the big publicly traded game publishing companies, and of course, because of that, it all trickles down to the poor bastards who are the developers, and also to us. Now, sometimes that pressure is quiet. Investors want growth, profit, they want a return, they want companies to make money so that they can sell their shares and collect some lovely dividends. Sometimes, though, that pressure is a hell of a lot louder. It can be hostile or activist investors pushing companies to cut costs, to sell assets, to restructure, or to chase some specific strategy. You can think of, say, Ubisoft. You can think about Square Enix, companies where investors have bought in specifically so they can reshape the business in the way that they want. Contrasting that is today's story and the Bank of America analysis, because it's framed in very different terms. When an analyst says that Take-Two should raise the price point for the entire industry, we need to be extremely clear about whose interests are actually being centered in this. Bank of America is looking at price power. They're basically looking at the one game with enough market force to make a higher number feel a bit more normal, and by virtue of that, become the new normal. In maybe 5 years, you and me may still remember this, but for a lot of other people, games will just cost $80 and they won't think about it anymore. So far we've covered the spark notes, but it actually does go a bit deeper, and I've got a quote for you, right? We also heard from attendees that the industry, which is perceived as struggling, would have difficulty selling games for $80 if GTA 6 came out at $70. And this is not just like some tiny little bit of context. I think this is actually really important, because it's basically an argument that if GTA 6, widely expected to be the biggest entertainment launch in human history, that if it sets a $70 price, that it basically limits the entire rest of the industry. Because if GTA can't do $80, how the hell can you? Even say a top tier franchise game from Nintendo or PlayStation would really struggle with that. And honestly, this comparison is the kind of brutal bit. It's fairly cold, but in a way it's not stupid. And that's because price anchoring truly matters. Perceived value truly matters. I mean, we saw a smaller version of this when the whole Silksong pricing conversation happened, right? Where some people actually argued that a $20 price tag from basically a hugely anticipated game, was such a good deal for $20 that it would make other games look expensive by comparison. Obviously though, the similar effect would be way larger with GTA 6, where if it's $70, then $70 really is the highest price this industry feels it can go to. And that even if the rest of the industry didn't immediately follow, the whole point is basically, well, the Overton window for pricing has been moved higher. Now, this is where the framing does get a wee bit slippery, right? Because instead of admitting that they think Take-Two can just make more money by doing this, the analyst framed it so differently, where basically, if Take-Two doesn't increase the price, they're failing the entire games industry. It's fully framed as being their responsibility to increase to $80 in order to uplift the entire games industry, and that basically them doing this would be an act of industry stewardship. How do you feel about that? I mean, I think it's a pretty pessimistic view, and rather tellingly, it's a view that Bank of America seems to want to manifest into reality. That's why they're putting this all out into the info space. And that this is their goal is kind of something they basically just gave away with the final statement that they made on pricing. Notably, Dasuki and his team think the higher price level would be congruent with the notion that AI will raise the value of games to consumers. So the implication is, right, that AI, which of course is never actually defined, but that somehow it will make games just way more valuable to us players. Of course, that's typically not how technology is sold to investor types. It typically is sold to investors in terms of faster and cheaper production. Maybe they mean the potential of like Gen AI chatbot response systems, I don't know exactly, but regardless, right? It's an assumption that doesn't really ring that true to me, probably the same for you. And that's especially because we're talking about Grand Theft Auto of all games. I bring that up because back in February, the boss of that whole shindig of Take-Two, he's called Strauss Zelnick, very interesting fella, but that's a side story. He said this to GameIndustry.biz, with regards to GTA 6, Gen AI has zero part in what Rockstar Games is building, their worlds are handcrafted, that's what differentiates them. So it's kind of funny then, we have Bank of America saying this, but Rockstar's very own pitch about the game is almost the opposite, that GTA 6 is valuable because humans obsessed over it, because every street, every building, every detail has been made with intent by a person. And that does ring true. And the thing is, this is not the only assumption the Bank of America team are making that's not really ringing true. Shareholders and investor analysts seem to believe that if they simply raise prices, they'll just get more profit. Unfortunately for them, there's a little thing that complicates that, and that little thing is actually called data. Yeah, the numbers don't agree with them. Get a load of this number. 62% of players no longer buy full price games. That's wild, and it's the finding of a report from IGN's parent company, and the number actually gets worse the older the demographic. I did not expect that to be true, but 42% of Gen Zs will buy a full price game, only 38% of millennials. As for the Gen Xers, 20% of them will be shelling out full price for a game. Maybe not the largest gaming audience, but hey, Gen Xers love freemium, I guess maybe that's why they're all going mad about Shrimp Jesus over on Facebook. For someone to buy a game day one at full price, it has to feel like a culturally unavoidable event, right? You can't miss it, it's gotta feel like that. GTA 6 has got that, but most other games don't, and you can't build an industry-wide pricing strategy around the one game that breaks every normal rule. And it gets worse for the industry that Bank of America thinks this sort of thing could succeed. Because if we're looking at $70 games at all, we actually need to recognize we're not even looking at the best-selling games. Take a look at this report from Newzoo, and it maps out that with so few major AAA $70 like game releases in the last few years, that actually the $30 and $50 price band is the fastest growing one in the games market. Now the AAA tier still makes up the majority of revenue in console and PC, but growth in that area is actually slowing. So it does actually seem that selling more copies at a lower price is just as viable a strategy as charging a high price for a big fat margin on every game. That makes a lot of sense to me. I think if we look at the declines that consoles have had, I guess the fairly iffy hit rate with AAA games, it really seems obvious to me that we've damaged ourselves as an industry, just kind of chasing revenue per individual customer as much as we have. Now, going the complete other direction into free-to-play slop hell, that's obviously terrible, but I think a world where there's really good premium feeling like $30 and $50 games, That's really good for just getting more people into the hobby, and I think we need that. But this kind of thing may not be what some of the investors actually want here. You see, despite this analyst's framing, they're not really looking at the entire industry. You see, what they're looking at is basically the margins. The margins that could be higher if they pressure the biggest publishers and biggest games to push those prices up. They're not looking at the potential pushback from players or the sentiment shift that may happen if prices rise again. They're just looking at some numbers. They're looking at the possibility of more money without, any change in product. And shockingly enough, that means that they're not actually even aligned with the people they're talking about. Take-Two. Okay, let's bring it back to Strauss Zelnick, CEO of Take-Two, and of course, author of Becoming Ageless. What an absolute unit. Now, Strauss thinks that consumer value and game prices aren't really the same thing, and there's a quote from him. It was captured at Icon by IGN. I think it does make a good bit of sense. So this is what he says. Consumers pay for the value that you bring to them, and our job is to charge way, way less of the value delivery. That's an interesting one. And he explains in the overall statement he makes that games, if you pay $60 or $70, they're still priced way below historical inflation. But he said that that's not the lens through which we look. Admittedly, for him, it is easier to say that than most developers, because most other developers aren't making, say, $500 million a year in GTA Online revenue from, GTA Online, a thing that came out ages ago. By the way, we know that data because of the Rockstar hack. There is still a feeling of pressure with the GTA launch. In an interview at the Icon event that he did with Jason Schreier, Zelnick suggests that, quote, expectations are so high for the quality and the sales. Considering the Bank of America, analysts are openly saying that this game has, got to be so good and charge extra money so that it can redefine the entire business model of the industry, I think Strauss is right. The expectations are high. Maybe so high that the Bank of America team themselves have also gotten high and came out with a statement that they've made. So, you know what? Rather than me make a big declarative statement about it, how about I just throw it to you in the comments? Do you think he's wrong? I mean, I do think he might be wrong. But you know who's probably also wrong? Anyone who thought that spending as much money as PlayStation did in Bungie was a good idea. And my god, it doesn't seem to have been a good idea. If you want to learn more about that, you got to check out this report that we just published. It's looking pretty dire for Bungie, gotta be real.